In today's podcast episode, we talk about how quickly things move, and how especially in the trans rights space, change is coming very rapidly. Now we're talking in terms of terminology, how a term once used to describe gender diversity is now no longer used, and one day the term we currently use will be something different again. But the same is true with the news, and in the intervening months since February, when this interview was recorded, a lot has happened. And we tried as best we could to drop little reminders of that while speaking, so as to remind you, the listener, that this all takes place in February of 2024. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications person at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. A few weeks ago on this podcast, I spoke with Dr. Jessie Bossé and Dr. Françoise Soucette about cisnormativity in healthcare. And as we discussed, cisnormativity is pretty much ingrained in every structure and system we experience every day. And one of the major issues there is that a lot of what medical professionals and educators and even structural engineers do is based on research that is itself cisnormative. My guests today are trying to find the best way to address that and to fix it.
Hi, my name's Misha. My pronouns are they and he. I'm currently a student at the Université de Québec à Montréal, UQAM, studying psychosocial intervention. I'm a research participant on the project with Konrad, and I'm also a queer and trans person that's really excited to be talking about the project that we'll be talking about here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And Konrad.
Hi, my name is konrad-czechowski. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa. My pronoun is he. And most of my research, my dissertation research is in the area of housing and homelessness and romantic sexual relationships among people experiencing homelessness and how that could be a unique source of support to help people exit homelessness. And I've also done some side sex research about consent. And then from that research emerged this opportunity to study how to best include trans identities in research. And then I ended up conducting that research, collaborating with Misha, and here we are.
Well, terrific. And it's that research that I want to talk about today. When I first met, and for those of you listening at home, I first met Konrad when I first started at the CPA. And I think you had just got the Jean and Dick Pettifor Award, some funding to start this research. And so that's what we were talking about. And I am excited to finally be able to see the end results of what you've been working on. So I'm hoping you can, whichever one of you feels comfortable giving me the recap of what you've discovered over the last couple of years. Konrad, what is the result of your research?
Sure. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the process, about what we actually did in terms of the methods a little bit. And then maybe Misha can highlight a couple of results that we've developed and collaboratively developed as well. So to start off, we've called this the Trans Inclusion Project. It's a two-part participatory action research project. So participatory action research is this exciting kind of research that it's a general approach that emphasizes collaboration between researchers and participants in the research process. So it's really actually kind of perfectly designed to look at various social issues, and especially to really try and empower and include people from the affected community that we are quote unquote studying. So traditional research has this kind of inherent power structure where you have researcher doing the studying, maybe the subject or participants almost like being studied. But participatory action research aims to really collaborate with people within the community itself to give them some decision-making power within the research process itself. So what do we actually do? I started by conducting 15 interviews with people who identify as trans or non-binary, just about some general topics about how best to include them in research. How should researchers ask questions for in-person kinds of research, and all the way down to what kind of gender options to include, what kind of decision, how do we make decisions about analyzing data in a way that's inclusive of their identities. And then after those 15 interviews, I invited some people from those interviews, Misha being one of them. Misha was one of the people that I interviewed, and invited them to continue to collaborate if they wanted to. Several of them did volunteer to continue to collaborate. And then we developed an online survey based on a lot of the responses got people across North America who are trans and non-binary to complete the online surveys, had about 400 people to really kind of confirm some of the findings that we had received verbally from people in the interviews, and also kind of expand on some of those findings. And, this was a nice opportunity to be able to occasionally consult with some of the people from initial interviews themselves, and some who are more excited, engaged, and wanted to actually continue to contribute, such as Misha, had the opportunity to kind of continue to do some collaborative analysis on the data. So before this podcast, Misha and I had chosen a couple of results that we could go ahead and highlight today. And we'll probably have in written form, we'll be able to disseminate more of our results in written form later on in this year. Misha, myself, and several of our collaborators, supervised by Christelle Shaughnessy, this overall project. We also have Marilyn Ashley, Aaron Curtis, Claudel Abdo, who are also collaborators on this project as we kind of put this together, and we're able to kind of get that out in written form. So Misha, maybe you can go ahead and maybe talk about some of our findings as they relate to recommendations that initially emerged from the in-person interviews for in-person research for cisgender researchers could do when conducting research in person, for example, interviewing people, different things that people can do to create a kind of safer, non-threatening environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So to go over those recommendations for practitioners, researchers, doctors' offices, pretty much anyone interacting with queer and trans people in person, we had a few interesting findings. So the elements that were most helpful, most highly recommended for those were: number one, being up to date on current language, which we'll get into a little bit later, what exactly that is, what that sounds like, what that looks like. But in general, keeping yourself up to date on terminology, pronouns, things like that. Next, having a study recruiter and or a researcher that is trans themselves, can self-identify as trans, which is obviously extremely helpful if that can be a person that's in the position of power or research or direct interaction with trans participants helps, and personally for me, an element of safety. And also just beginning at the interview or interaction by stating your pronouns, whoever is doing it as a general practice, helps show that that is, something that is valued and important, and that is a modeled behavior that helps in the interaction. Actions that were a little bit less helpful rated, but still can be helpful nonetheless, would include if the interviewer admits that they may not be fluent in the language or fluent in using a pronoun that they're less practiced in. Still helpful. Obviously, if you are learning and always, trying to improve on that, that's great and shows that you're putting in an effort. If you, mess up, just move on, apologize, and keep the interaction going. A few elements that were more in person and like physical, so to speak, were ones that were deemed personally by myself as could be helpful, could be a little bit performative, such as having pride, such as having pride or trans flags in the physical location or office. For example, in a doctor's office could be super helpful, but if the interaction isn't that great, or if the practitioner isn't actually up to date on the language, those two could cancel each other out. You see what I mean?
So having the flag there in and of itself checks a box, but doesn't actually mean anything if you're not going to then follow up and do the work to make it an inclusive space, right?
100%. Yeah, a lot of the recommendations that we're highlighting here are the ones that are more, I personally believe, to be learning and qualitative and interpersonal rather than a simple solution that you can just tack on into your office, like trans-friendly book or having a photo of a couple that is queer and that will, instantly absolve you of doing the work. It's a constant, learning process and always something that can be improved on and work that is ongoing to, just simple actions you can take to make sure that your actions match the pride flag or trans flag in your office.
So I'm hoping we can sort of back up a little bit to even before this study started and talk about the need for it. Part of this series, what we've talked about is cisnormativity in healthcare settings, which is what you're touching on here, doctors' offices and so on. And the idea there being that so much of the work that's been done, the research that's been done, and the people who are doing, who are the doctors, who are surgeons, who are psychologists working in those spaces, are cisgendered, and that has been the standard. And it's difficult for them to always know how to approach something outside of a gender binary. And when we're talking about academics, I imagine this is the same situation. The studies that have been conducted for the longest time, right? And I remember, Konrad, you and I talking about this, where you gather, 1,000 participants for a study, and 498 of them are women and 497 of them are men. Well, what do you do with the other 5? You normally would just, let's exclude them from the study because we don't have a space for them, or let's lump them in with one of the other categories. If it's a transgender woman, then we'll put her with the women. If it's a transgender man, we'll put him with the men. And there's no good way, or hasn't been. So tell me a little bit about where we were at before you started this study and what prompted it in the first place. What are the sort of downstream effects of cisnormativity in research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're really touching there, Eric, on the impetus for this study, because I was trying to analyze some of my data. We're considering doing a comparison of men and women. And I had, some folks who identified themselves as, say, non-binary in my data. And then it wasn't quite clear with whom to group them in, or would they even want to be grouped with one group or the other? And I wasn't terribly satisfied with the kinds of recommendations or best practice literature that I could find. And literature that I would find, it wasn't all that clear that was necessarily based on actual lived experience of people from the community or recommendations from people from the community itself. So what I ended up doing is talking to people from the community as part of this more kind of formalized research process. A lot of it really largely depends on the goals of the researcher when we make these kinds of decisions. But one of the things that emerged from talking to a lot of people in the community as part of this research process was really to try and give people as much agency and choice as possible within the research process. So including an extra question. So, if they identify themselves as non-binary, for example, you can then have another question and say that to describe our sample, we're going to identify people by their genders, or we're going to group people into these different groups. Which group would you fit best in? Which group would you like us to include you in? Or we're going to do this kind of analysis, where we're going to compare these groups, and we actually need fairly large groups. So would you want to be grouped with any of these groups, or even excluded from the analysis? So we're slowly moving in that direction of giving people those kinds of options. And that was really kind of my reason for wanting to start this kind of a project, and then to kind of just see where it takes us. So it's largely fairly open-ended, guided by some potential gaps in existing recommendations and best practice literature that I was hoping we could at least start to inform with our research.
And I think that's the big key, is starting to inform, right? There's a long way to go with this, and there's a lot of research, a lot of gaps that have been created over the years by not including a lot of groups in research projects and that sort of thing. And I'm thinking that, your work with the homeless in the first place might have been one of the reasons that this came to your attention. I've worked with a group here in Ottawa that helps homeless youth for many, many years. We recently did a survey of the jobs program at that organization and surveyed the youth who were there trying to find employment, and found that 40% of them identified as non-binary or transgender, that they did not identify as cisgender. And that's a gigantic amount of people, considering the general population and how common it is.
Absolutely.
I mean, I definitely see a connection between the research that we're doing and ways in which we can improve the day-to-day material realities of queer and trans people. The connection between healthcare and best practices for including trans people in these studies is a clear one to me. For example, if we can have better metrics and numbers around how to best care for and have trans people access healthcare, that can, at a base level, drastically improve the quality and livelihood of trans people. Research, shows that trans people's ability to access gender-affirming, life-saving care can often be the difference between, their mental well-being, their mental health, whether they thrive or not, from a young age all the way to adulthood. And the link between, best practices of how to include trans people in that research starts in those numbers, starts in their representation. So yeah, as a trans person, I definitely see the results of trans flourishing and also difficulties in accessing a lot of resources myself. And it's definitely at the forefront of why I avidly try to include myself in research projects like this to share my personal experience, not being able to speak on behalf of an entire community, but at least share my own. And as to why, I believe that including trans people in research is key, so that we can not only improve trans people's lives, but also influence the policies and legislators who also make these decisions around healthcare and policies that, influence trans people's day-to-day lives.
For sure. And I mean, we've been talking about this in the context of many other things as well. Historically, psychology, for example, the studies that have been conducted have excluded Black people and Indigenous people in a lot of ways because of the sort of Eurocentric nature of psychology as a discipline, other disciplines in a similar way. And now, and I'm thinking about it in terms of gender being on a spectrum.
Yeah, I can definitely speak a little bit to that, and I'll definitely turn the mic over to Konrad, who I'm sure has many things to say for this. That made me think of a response that I wanted to mention also in response to the cisnormativity and research portion, which is, yes, not including trans people, not including two-spirit people, not including Black people, Indigenous people, and, with our research focusing on gender is not only harmful, but it's also from a practice standpoint inaccurate. If your research doesn't include genders that are beyond the binary, it's just bad research, if I may say it that way, or it's something that doesn't reflect the current reality that we're living in and that we've always been living in. So in terms of including people beyond this sort of Euronormative context, I definitely see a connection with, research, participatory action research. Obviously, that's, what we did here. And I think including the communities that you're consulting with is a really powerful way to ensure that your research is accurate to the communities that you're trying to represent. And I see this as a really radical way to ensure that research is a changing landscape, to include, to ideally pay, to involve the communities that you're consulting with, to really challenge these connections between what I see as colonialism and the gender binary, of how, Europe imported the gender binary to Turtle Island, and then all of a sudden it's all over our research methods, pushing that and reshaping that, and hopefully changing the norms of how gender is represented in research is how I see this, project as being a puzzle piece. And yeah,
and I really like that idea that, it's harmful and inaccurate. So, it can be quite, when we talk about harm in these contexts, if someone's reading a survey that they're asked to fill out and they see man, woman, and that's it, and they can't really represent themselves there, or man, woman, other, and what does that communicate to them if they have to indicate other, that they're somehow different? And so there's these subtle ways that as researchers we can inadvertently communicate to people that we ask to give us their time to complete our surveys, that they're somehow different. And at the end of the day, as Misha very well put, it does also lead to inaccurate data. That person might just guess, or they might just skip the question. And so we don't get an opportunity then to accurately represent them within our research. And as researchers, it's really important to be as reflexive as possible. I come from a tradition of community psychology, and reflexivity is a really important value there, where community psychologists often encourage themselves to really try and reflect on their practices and not be so rigid with our practices. And especially as these things do change a lot, just, as social movement develops, and as a social movement is fast developing, as trans rights movements right now are really gaining a fair bit of ground, that means that a lot of change is happening. And so that also means that as researchers, we need to, at minimum, just do our best to try to stay up to date on best practice literature and be open to changing the words that we use, the methods that we use. It's quite possible that when I listen to this podcast several years down the road, I will listen to the words that I'm using, the terms that I'm using, and I'll be like, oh yeah, well that changed. I don't really use those words anymore. And that's fine. That's fine. It's not that much effort to just change the way we refer to certain groups, and just to kind of have that, I suppose, that level of humility, just to be able to adjust not only our research practices, but also just kind of how we conduct ourselves within the research process itself.
Yeah, you mentioned the trans rights movement and how that's picking up a lot of steam, and there's a lot to it. But at the same time, there's the anti-trans rights movement, which has gained a lot of steam, sort of as, I don't know if that's a pushback to trans people getting rights, or if it's just an opportunist way of making a political point or getting clout online or whatever it might be. But what ends up, I think, getting lost a lot along the way, a lot of the time, is scientific literacy. And by that, I mean, when you see, Alberta's just put out this list of things that they want to do that are, anti-trans in every way imaginable, and they sort of cite a vague science that no one can really point to. New Brunswick, they just did the same thing and cited a study where the authors of the study had to come out and say, yeah, you've got that wrong. You didn't understand what you were talking about, but you can find an expert somewhere who will back you up, because there are people out there who will just come in and say, I'm an expert. I will testify to the validity of this anti-trans measure. I'm wondering if the knowledge mobilization, the mobilization of what it is you're doing, how you're thinking about that, how you're considering it when you're talking about explaining what you're doing to the world, right? Or specifically to the academic community who might make use of this, who might then say, okay, we definitely want to be as inclusive as possible and as accurate as possible. Who are you speaking to when you're disseminating the results of this research?
The answer to bad science is good science, or better science. And so what we really need to do there is do our best to communicate our results as clearly as possible. And when they're misrepresented, it's really just an exercise of trying to correct that as much as possible. But we do have this cultural moment now, and I'm a bit of an optimist, and maybe that comes from a place of privilege as a cisgender person. But I see this moment right now where there is a lot of attention, for better or for worse, on the trans movement in general. And this is an opportunity for us to develop as much evidence as we can for people to be able to make evidence-informed decisions and to try and guide this cultural conversation that we're having. Science will be willfully or not willfully misrepresented, and that's something that we have to deal with. But I think that, at least from a researcher standpoint, my response to that is to communicate as clearly as possible and to develop as good of an evidence base to be able to inform the broader conversation.
Yeah. Misha, are you optimistic?
I have to be. Yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack. My focus in this conversation would probably be on the importance of, like you said, knowledge translation in any research, as well as social and cultural impacts of that knowledge translation, right? The research will only go as far as it can impact a person's day-to-day life, especially beyond academic spaces. And to me, I think the importance of integrating the best practices you have and the, readings that you do to prepare yourself, or the language that you keep yourself up to date on, extends into the day-to-day as well. And I think if every researcher could be able to follow at least 2 or 3 trans people and read up on a few trans organizations that are fighting for trans people's rights right now, I think that could be greatly impactful. So I think trans people's rights are definitely under attack for a number of reasons right now. And scientific research is integral to helping defend that. The CPA's stances, I saw on your Twitter, you'd posted statement on the CPA posted a statement on the defense of trans people having rights. That's fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
Taking that as far as any organization can, to be currently vocal, to use your platforms, use your voices to take a stance can be a matter of life or death right now. As you said, trans people's, the difference between trans people having access or not to gender affirming care, to social supports, to spaces and individuals that support them, can sometimes be a matter of life or death. So my answer to your question, do I have hope? Right now, with the directions of what the conservative government has been stating right now, with the global wave of anti-trans sentiment, overall, I am not. However, I don't have a choice to be hopeful or not. I do have hope for, our community and the people who back it to use the powers that they have to continue to defend trans rights.
So you guys have come up with sort of a roadmap of sorts, recommendations, best practices for researchers, for people in healthcare settings. You've figured some of this out. I presume you're going to continue to do research from here, and the research that you've done has been specifically with the trans and non-binary, a gender diverse population. Going forward, how is what you've learned here going to inform the research you do, the next project that you work on? Are you going to be looking to do it in a different way than maybe you would have before to ensure that sort of inclusion? And what is that going to look like?
Yeah, so I'm really hoping to continue to build on this. And when I say I'm hoping, I mean we're hoping. I hope that Misha sticks around and continues to very meaningfully collaborate as they have been. And it's really a process. And we initially disseminated some of these results at the Canadian Psychological Association annual convention last summer, where Misha and I co-presented some of these results. Now we're writing them up, and we should be publishing them later this year. And it's as a graduate student right now, I have not only I'm not just doing this off the side of my desk, it's off the side of my side desk. I really hope to eventually get to a point, and continue down an academic path where I could really make this a lot more central, where I could have more resources and a lot more of my own time to be able to further this line of research specifically. And I'd also like to expand into, given that I'm doing a degree in clinical psychology and being trained as a clinical psychologist, I'm hoping to also move into the area of training for gender affirming care, just creating safe spaces within the therapy room for clients who are gender diverse.
What kind of terminology are we talking about here?
So within our study, what we did was we asked people in the initial 15 interviews, what kind of terminology did they broadly view as acceptable to refer to the trans community as a whole, particularly in a research context. Got some ideas for some terms, and then what we did was we took those terms plus some that have been identified in other existing literature. And then on the larger sample of 400 people across North America who identify as trans or non-binary, we asked them to rate on a scale from completely unacceptable to completely acceptable, whether the following terms are acceptable when it comes to referring to the trans community as a whole. So I'll walk us through a few of those, and maybe Misha can go ahead and just maybe contextualize some of those. Trans was viewed as was very, very frequently rated as very acceptable. Transgender, trans and non-binary, trans or non-binary, all quite acceptable. two-spirit, genderqueer, gender diverse, also quite acceptable. There were some that were a little bit less acceptable, or maybe the ratings were, some folks rated them as a lot more acceptable, some a lot less, so a lot more variability in some ratings. And so that would be gender non-conforming, using folks, F-O-L-X, instead of folks, F-O-L-K-S, gender minority as well. And then there was transgendered, which was rated more consistently unacceptable, though some still viewed it as acceptable. And then there was transsexual, which was pretty consistently rated as unacceptable terminology to refer to the whole trans community as a whole. Although I will note that some smaller proportion did consider it acceptable. So maybe, Misha, you can go ahead and contextualize some of those, maybe speculate on why some might be less acceptable than others.
Yeah. Sorry, just before you do, did you ask people why? Was that part of the reasoning here, or are you just sort of speculating as to why that may be? Like, my thinking is transgendered with an ED would be unacceptable because it connotates a pathologizing of it. Is that?
Yeah, a little bit as if something's being done to someone. So in the 15 interviews, we did go into greater. The advantage of having these long form qualitative interviews is that we really get down into the specific details. Misha's interview was actually the longest, and we spent a lot of time talking about terminology, which was excellent.
It's true.
And so that was the space where we really had the opportunity to iron a lot of these out, and then later over here on the larger samples, really just to kind of confirm and see. If we look at a much broader population, are the views pretty similar to what we saw in the initial 15?
Yeah, terminology is huge. It's always evolving, and it's always going to be indicated by the community themselves. So yeah, I'll speak to these findings as they've been represented, and I can also speak to a few of them personally as to why I might imagine some of them might be not helpful or as we've interpreted it. So yeah, so the 1, 2, 3, 4 terms, we have transsexual. It's, you could say, a bit of an outdated term. It's preferred to use transgender or just trans. The second term, transgendered, the connotation, exactly, Eric, a bit like you said, it's this idea that it's something that's passively being done to you, oh my God, when it's just an identity or a person's gender. And gender minority, exactly, Konrad, you mentioned it, I believe. It's a negative connotation. I believe gender diverse is the latest. We're recording this in February of 2024. So that might evolve by the time you're listening to this. But yeah, gender diverse rather than gender minority. And the fourth
this will come out in May. So when it does, we'll know by then, presumably, whether this is all still
these things evolve fast, but I'm not sure if that fast. It'll be fine by then.
It won't be 2025. It'll be May of this year.
Yeah, and folks with an X instead of just written as folks has been a linguistic development that has been written to be more inclusive, but ultimately kind of like how trans with an asterisk has been at some point, I believe, a phase of trying to be more inclusive, which is also listed in our results. From what I gather is a bit of like a performative linguistic element that doesn't actually really change much. So it's best to make it simpler and use folks KS. And I will add, kind of like you said, if a person says, I'm non-binary, best to use that terminology as they give it to you. So if someone tells you my gender is transsexual, you can call me as such, even though that's not listed on our recommended, acceptable uses of terminology for researchers. If it's best to default to the person and what they tell you is kind of my bottom line.
Yeah, the folks thing strikes me. I've seen that with people writing Latinx. So that you're not saying Latino or Latina and you're including everybody in that. That seems like it is, in fact, something that is inclusive language, whereas folks with an X, I don't know how that would change what folks with a K already connotates. I'm curious to know if you found a difference in the acceptability of certain terms based on the age of the participants. If there were some I know some older people either still hang on to some of the language that was they were using, in the 80s, or have really wanted to move on from some of the language that was used in the 80s. And I'm wondering if you found a difference there.
Yeah, I don't have that breakdown right in front of me right now. If I remember correctly, I believe when I looked at the people who rated transsexual as more acceptable did tend to be of older age groups. And so, yeah, I mean, language evolves, and it's also, some people who belong to the community might still identify with certain terms that other people within the community don't really identify with or even find offensive or harmful. And so, right now we're talking about these broad general terms as researchers referring to the whole community and trying to do our best to use the most accurate and hopefully non-offensive language possible. But when it comes to an individual context, it's a lot different. In an individual context, it really just depends on, as Misha mentioned, whatever this person says they prefer to be referred to, whatever which way they prefer to be referred to, that's generally speaking the best way to go. But in the absence of knowing what somebody prefers, or if we're just talking about a general group or a general population, then that's generally speaking what our research was looking at in this specific case. And as a researcher as well, I think a lot of this is just, it kind of comes back to that idea of just being willing to change our practices. If the evidence is increasingly showing that a lot of people in the community don't like the word transsexual and don't want to be referred to as transsexuals, then maybe we just shouldn't use transsexual as researchers, especially as cis researchers. And so it's one of those things where we might. I also changed one of my practices pretty early on. That I titled this study initially as trans and gender nonconforming folks that we were doing this research with. In one of my early interviews, someone said, "Oh, I really don't really like the word nonconforming. It kind of makes me feel, when someone says I'm gender nonconforming, it's almost like as if I'm not conforming within society, or it's as if I'm just like a nonconformist. And I don't want to be a nonconformist. This is just who I am." And so I was like, "Oh, that's a good point. Okay." And then I found a couple other people mention that to me. So I said, "Okay, I'm just going to use trans and non-binary as my tentative umbrella term. And perhaps, like I said before, several years from now, my terminology may change." And that's the nature of evolving practices as we get better reasons to or better evidence to inform those evolutions.
Yeah, and a few things I may add, as we talk more like further in the conversation to, ask, how do I put this into practice as a researcher, or what do I take away from this? If it were to be as simple as in my next research that includes gender, perhaps not gender-based analysis, because that's a bit more complicated. How do I include, genders beyond the binary? And that might be as simple as including, what is your gender? Man, woman, trans, non-binary, other, or simply allowing people to add their gender in that other and then organizing it however you may, allowing people to self-identify and or choose their gender from a drop-down list of, I think we have a list of as many as 12 or so, including Two-Spirit, which I believe also just gets overlooked for some reason, or I think is a useful place to start. I actually don't know if Two-Spirit gets overlooked often. At least I often don't see it in research, but maybe it does, and I hope that it does. Yeah, that's like a great place to start. And a practice that I wanted to speak to that I wanted to have mentioned earlier, perhaps we can edit this out to pop it in earlier.
I'm afraid we can't, but please continue.
The idea that having a transparent justification for sensitive questions can also be really huge if you're interacting with a population to whom asking a really sensitive or invasive question might be more difficult. You would want to ideally, at the minimum, explain to them, have that justification as to why you're posing them this question, that they have the choice to not answer this question, as an act of care and thoughtfulness to the communities with whom you're engaging with as a practice. That personally, if a researcher does do that, makes me feel really considered. And on the contrary, if a researcher asks me a really, triggering question and just doesn't explain why, I might challenge that and be like, why are you asking me this? And is this actually helpful towards your research? And are you considering how this makes me feel? And might make me feel like the research actually does not care about trans people or is just tokenizing that information. So that could be a huge practice in person as well.
Can you give me an example of a way that you might give that justification when you're asking that question? A way you might phrase the reason that we're asking for your gender or something else, your sexual preference, I guess, would be another one, right?
Sure. So to be a little bit more specific with that one, I would say an example would be if your research is looking into the experiences of trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people's experiences and harm being caused to them or sexual trauma. If your research gets really into and around more difficult, triggering topics like this, to, at a base level, explain why you're asking and what exactly you're going to do with that information. But also, if not necessarily your research for example, if your research doesn't deal with topics like this, if you were to inquire about trans people's experiences with medical systems, that could be a difficult topic. If you were to ask a trans person to recount a story of a time when they had a difficult experience with a medical provider, which I'm sure many trans people do and have, that could also be difficult. And any experience or piece of information that you're asking someone to share that might not be the most comfortable, I would just say provide what you're going to be doing with that information and why you're asking it and the option to not share. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It strikes me that's a good practice for all questions, even the non-invasive ones, to explain what you're trying to get out of the answers that you're seeking, right?
And I have an example from our survey, actually. When at the start of our online survey, we made very clear that we want to make sure that we're getting the most accurate and updated information from you who's about to take the survey. We also mentioned that some of the words that we use might be offensive to read or off-putting to some people, and we apologize for this in advance. But then we also mentioned gathering information on what we should use and what we shouldn't use is exactly the point of the survey, and your responses will be used to educate others and educate other researchers at the same time. So just kind of starting with that start point of really justifying why we're actually doing this. If we expect that some questions might be off-putting or even triggering in any kind of way, we're just kind of letting people know that there's actually going to be there may be a little bit of pain throughout here, but there's actually a lot of benefit. Or of course, this is all ethics approved and everything, but it can be very helpful to kind of preface the survey a little bit with that. And that doesn't necessarily affect the validity of the survey. It's not like anyone's going to answer necessarily in any different way. But for some people who might be put off by some of the words that we use, that we need to use as we talk about those kinds of words, it can be quite helpful.
And I imagine that it's a pretty important thing in any sort of research where you are doing a survey, where you're specifically or recruiting a group of people of any kind of research that takes place in that way. It's probably pretty important that the people who are doing it are comfortable, regardless of the type of research or the type of questions that are being asked, right? Just in terms of data collection.
Absolutely. And sometimes we may even mention throughout the survey, if we ask, please select the following options that fit with your gender identity. We're going to be using this information to describe the people who completed our study, to describe our sample. And sometimes even having that additional context helps someone answer that question as accurately as possible in considering what kind of information we are trying to get.
Something I would even add is if I can see a drop-down menu of options that takes into account, that offers options beyond the binary. But if I say don't know the researchers or the intent very well, let's say, if I were to know choosing trans and or non-binary would disqualify me or not from the research, might make me choose man or woman, depending on how I'm feeling that day, more, likely. So I think it all kind of comes down to how, Konrad, exactly like you said, thoughtful, the research comes across, how much it takes the participants into consideration, and whether it might just whether you flag to people that you might be hostile towards this group or not. And for trans people and for marginalized people, I think a base level approach to society, because of how society treats a lot of marginalized groups, the approach and the posture can be very on the defensive and careful until you can, until the researchers, until the people you're interacting with can prove themselves as otherwise. And I think that falls a lot on the researchers. And I think the research that we've done, for example, has done a great job of at least making me feel at ease. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And it really takes me back to that idea. Earlier, we were talking about, flags maybe being performative, or do they really signal a safe space? But it's this idea of signaling, and you might need to do that signaling in a research survey, or you might need to do that in a kind of in a space that you welcome someone from the community. And when we're talking about trans and non-binary youth being overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness, if you look at that population, for example, why are they overrepresented? Well, because they've often been rejected from their households. Their families had rejected them, and so they're coming. We want to say offer them services, and they already come from this context of this horrendous rejection that ended up leaving them on the street in their youth, especially. And so, if we want any hope to actually be able to deliver services to them, then it's especially important that we do signal and show them and try to really convince them that this genuinely is a safe space, because they're not used to being in safe spaces. And so from a service delivery standpoint, it can be extra important to be especially considerate of how are we going to signal that this is a genuinely safe space.
Something else that occurred to me while you were describing the evolution of this study is that I think it takes a certain amount of humility from the researcher, and in your case, you, to adjust the study as you go, to change the language that you're using in it, to make the study itself rather fluid so that you can make it increasingly more welcoming and more comforting and more safe for the people who are participating as you go, right? And rather than having the structure that you've set up at the beginning and sticking to that, you can amend it a little bit along the way and not use non-conforming, for example, which, and I can kind of see that, right? Like the idea that being gender diverse is somehow rebellious is kind of playing into the anti-trans talking points in a lot of ways, right? So I kind of see that. But I agree. I don't think I would have noticed that at the beginning. But yeah, once someone points it out, you make the adjustments. And maybe that's also something of a blueprint for researchers going forward, that you can make these adjustments as you go in order to increase the comfort of the people you're working with.
One of the more challenging parts of participatory research is really to relinquish some level of power. We have these convictions of exactly how our research should run and what methodological rigor is, and this kind of inflexible approach, because it's the best approach, of course. Our methods are all great and everything, but if we all of a sudden relinquish some of that power and in the context of having this methodological expertise and bring in someone with lived expertise, all of a sudden, if we're doing true power sharing, we're allowing them to change or to influence some of these methods. And sometimes we need to make compromises between what we think is perfectly methodologically rigorous versus something that's actually going to fit and capture someone's genuine lived experience. And so it's really that kind of balance. And I think that's one of the more challenging aspects of real participatory methods, to really let someone come and partner with you in the decision-making process.
All right. Well, let's close this out on just where do you guys want to see this go from here? Where are both of you going from here? Misha, let's start with you. Where are you going from here as a student, as a researcher over the next few years? And where do you hope that this leads?
So working on this project has been so much fun, from initially doing the research, the interview, getting the call to get invited as a participatory research participant, and doing the conference at the CPA, as well as this podcast moving forward. Konrad and I have been discussing some exciting plans to write the results of this, to potentially work on a few papers from this, which I would be absolutely delighted to contribute to as we continue to work on this. On my end, I am currently in my final semester of a one-year program, a certificate certificate in psychosocial intervention, and I hope to apply for and get accepted to school to be a sexologist at the University of Quebec at Montreal. If not, I seek to take other programs and do other studies, plan Bs, to be a therapist that specializes in gender and sexuality to help other queer and trans people live their best lives. So that's me on my end. What about you, Konrad?
For this project, I hope to continue to involve people from the community. I have, I believe, 6 other folks from the interviews who agreed to be contacted in the future to continue to consult and or collaborate on this project. And in developing the online portion, the online survey, we did consult with them, and some were fairly engaged. So, as we move forward, as we write this up, as we start to disseminate these findings, I hopefully those folks will still be quite willing to contribute, and we can continue to see where this project takes us. In September, I will graduate from my doctoral degree in clinical psychology, and I hope to continue to pursue a career in research at that point. And hopefully that career in research will mean that I'll be able to devote a lot more time and effort into furthering this area of research, perhaps trans inclusion 2 kind of study. We got some modest funding for this portion of the research from the Dr. Jean and Dick Pettifor Scholarship Fund. And if I do end up getting even more funding for an even larger project, that would be very, very exciting. So I'm hoping to go down that route and just see where this takes us.
The work is just beginning, and Konrad and Misha are at the forefront of what could be an exciting new direction for all of us. Thanks to them for taking the time to speak with me today, and to you at home for listening, streaming, downloading, and sharing today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our editor and producer is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.